There is one special conditional expression which we haven't seen and used thus far, and that's the so-called ternary operator or the ternary expression. It's important to understand that if statements themselves return no values, right? You just dump them into your code to then execute code conditionally. It's not like a function or a calculation with some operators. If statement doesn't return any value which you could store somewhere. Therefore, this, for example, does not work. You can't assign an if statement to a constant because this will not return anything. An if statement won't return anything, and this will actually be a syntax error, therefore. This is not allowed. But maybe you have code where you want to use a different value in, let's say, username or any other constant or variable, and the concrete value you do want to save in that constant depends on some condition. Actually, that is something which we have in our code already. Here in attack monster, we have max damage and log event, and these are variables that hold conditional values. They either hold for max damage, attack value, or strong attack value based on this condition, and thereafter we use that variable. So in the end here we have a variable where we store data that depends on some condition. But I do so by first setting up the variable and not assigning any value. And then we have a if condition, which we don't try to store in any variable or constant because that wouldn't work, as I mentioned. And then inside of the if condition, we assign values to max damage in this case and to log event as well. This is valid code and this works. But this snippet here doesn't work. But it would be convenient to have some kind of if statement that would work like this, where we kind of return a value in it, and then that returned value gets stored in a variable. Would save us some extra lines of code. Well, there is a solution for that. You can use the so-called ternary operator in such cases. It allows you to have an inline if statement, if you will, without the if keyword, because that can't be used inline, but with the question mark and colon operators here. And together they make up that ternary operator. Now, the logic here is simple. You first put your condition which you want to check, and there you can have any condition you could have in an if statement, including multiple conditions combined with and or. Then you have the question mark, and thereafter you have the value you want to use if the condition is true. And that's important. You have a value here, so something which could be stored in a constant. You don't put more complex code here, not multi-line code, not multiple expressions. You can't use an if statement here or define a new variable here. Instead, here after the question mark, you need some value that could be stored in a constant or a variable in any other place as well. So which you could directly assign with the equal sign to a variable or constant. And then you have a colon, and then you have your else value, and you need to specify this. So omitting that else value is not allowed. That would be a syntax error as well. So here we have the islog in condition, which probably is a boolean or some truthy or falsy value. And if that is true, we store max in username. If it's not true, I store null in username. This is a ternary operator in action. And we can actually use it in our code as well. We can change that code to not use this if statement. And let me make it very clear that there is nothing wrong with using an if statement like this. In some cases, using explicit if statements like this might also lead to more readable code than using ternary operators. But in some cases, you also can save some extra code by using ternary operators. And for example, here we can comment out the if statement and set max damage here equal to, and now I check if mode is equal to mode attack. And then if that's true, separated by a question mark, I assign the value to max damage that should be used if mode is equal to mode attack. So basically attack value here. And otherwise, separated by a colon, I use the else case. So in this case, strong attack value. And now we set that variable to either attack value or to strong attack value based on this condition. So on this condition, if mode is equal to mode attack. Now, of course, since I therefore never reassign a value here, previously we did do it because we assigned values in the if statement. Now we initialize this variable with a value right away, thanks to this ternary expression. We can also switch this to be a constant because I never assign a new value. We never use the equal sign after max damage again in this function here. And of course we can do the same for the log event. We can also switch this to a constant and now assign a value based on this check here. So check whether mode is equal to mode attack. And if that is the case, then we have a value of log event player attack. Otherwise, we have a value of log event strong attack here. We can also structure this across multiple lines like this. I did this with the auto formatting shortcut. As you see, it's no problem. As always in JavaScript, you can write your code along multiple lines here. JavaScript then finds out where this ends with the help of the semicolon here. So with that, we removed that if statement and we saved some extra code here. We are able to initialize these constants right away, and therefore we are able to use constants instead of variables. And as I mentioned, this is now not strictly better than using the if statement. Absolutely do use the if statement, especially if you had more complex conditions here and more complex values where you maybe also run some calculation first of all. So where you then all of a sudden have very long lines of code, then you might actually prefer having an if statement where this is more structured and readable. If you have relatively short conditions and value assignments as we have it here, however, then using the ternary expression is a fine alternative that can save you some extra code. Well, and with that, we should see that if I reload here and I start my game, that still works as before, but now with the help of the ternary expression. It's also worth noting that a ternary expression can also have nested conditions. So here where a value is expected, you can have some other check and then have a nested ternary expression where you then have the nested value and the nested alternative value here, but you should use that with caution because that can quickly lead to very hard to read code, and using a real if statement with else if blocks often is the better alternative to deeply nested ternary expressions. Nonetheless, it does work, it is supported, and it is something you can use, especially if you have short code, short conditions, and it's not getting unreadable.